Agriculture has never been simple. It's shaped by weather and markets, policy and politics, forces that often originate far from the farm gate. Headlines move fast, policies shift, markets react, but the impact of those changes doesn't just show up on screen, it shows up on farms and ranches, in families and rural communities. This podcast is about taking the time to explore what's happening in agriculture and what it means for the people living it, with clarity, context, and perspective. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered. As Washington moves closer to the mandatory review of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement this summer, farm and food groups are mounting an organized defense of the trade pact, warning that unraveling it would destabilize North America's integrated agricultural economy at a time when producers are already facing financial strain. The Agricultural Coalition for USMCA, a broad alliance of farm organizations, exporters, and supply chain groups, this week released a new economic analysis aimed squarely at policymakers weighing the agreement's future. Leaders from the three countries are required to begin the renewal process by July under the pact's 6-year joint review mechanism, part of a 16-year sunset structure written into the agreement when it replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in 2020. For agriculture, the stakes are unusually high. Krista Swanson, chief economist for the National Corn Growers Association and co-author of the report, says the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement has delivered measurable gains for U.S. producers since taking effect.
Without USMCA, U.S. agriculture would lose a critical source of stability, faced reduced market access, and fewer opportunities at a time when rural America can least afford disruption. In contrast, renewing the agreement reinforces stability, increases market access, and expands opportunity, building on the positive impacts that USMCA has delivered for farmers and consumers, and reinforcing its lasting contribution to growers and rural America. The positive impact for farmers and consumers alike is what makes USMCA a signature achievement of President Trump's first term. Renewing the agreement will solidify the president's legacy through the continued contribution to growers and rural America.
U.S. agricultural exports to Canada and Mexico have increased by $20 billion since implementation, reaching $60 billion in 2024, along with $1.2 billion in seafood exports. That represents 47% growth, far outpacing the 18% increase in U.S. agricultural exports to the rest of the world during the same period. But the coalition's message goes beyond trade values. Using a regional economic modeling tool, the study finds that agricultural and seafood exports to Canada and Mexico generated $149 billion in total economic contribution to the U.S. economy. USMCA-related trade supports nearly 500,000 full-time equivalent jobs and $36 billion in wages. For every $1 in the agricultural exports under the agreement, an additional $2.45 in economic activity is supported across the broader U.S. economy. In total, USMCA-linked trade supports $64 billion in U.S. GDP and $13 billion in tax revenue. Those figures come as farmers confront tightening margins driven by lower commodity prices, elevated input costs, and higher interest rates. While global export markets have shown volatility, Mexico and Canada have provided relative stability, particularly for corn, dairy, fresh produce, and processed food products. Mexico remains the top export market for U.S. corn, and Canada and Mexico together account for nearly half of U.S. dairy exports. Something Swanson says matters for producers, noting that farmers make multi-year investment decisions based on predictable market access and enforceable trade rules. While farm groups are defending the agreement's framework, they're also pressing for targeted fixes during the review. Shawna Morris, Executive Vice President of Trade Policy for the National Milk Producers Federation and the U.S. Dairy Export Council, says USMCA accounted for $3.6 billion in dairy exports in 2024, 44% of total U.S. dairy exports. But she argues Canada hasn't fully implemented its dairy market access commitments.
The USMCA review offers an unmissable opportunity to make some targeted enhancements so the agreement can live up to its full intended potential. Most notably, Canada still has a lot of work to do to hold up its end of the bargain on dairy. For years now, Canada's been playing games with access to its dairy tariff rate quotas, and that's resulted in shortfalls in the export access the U.S. negotiated for.
Under USMCA, Canada agreed to create tariff rate quotas allowing specified volumes of U.S. dairy products to enter at lower tariff levels. Morris says Canada's allocation system largely directs those quotas to domestic producers, limiting practical access for U.S. exporters and preventing full utilization of negotiated volumes. The U.S. has already pursued dispute settlement proceedings against Canada under USMCA, winning an initial ruling, though industry groups argue implementation gaps remain. Morris emphasizes that U.S. dairy isn't seeking to dismantle Canada's supply management system. Rather, she says, the industry wants Canada to hold up its end of the bargain by ensuring the access negotiated under USMCA functions as intended. Issues held over from initial negotiations are also seen with America's southern partner.
And likewise, although Mexico's been a strong partner in USMCA, 6 years into the agreement, they still haven't implemented some of their commitments on preserving access for common cheese names.
Corn growers are also looking to the review to reinforce science-based trade disciplines. Nancy Martinez, Director of Policy at the National Corn Growers Association, says the group is seeking clarification in the agreement to ensure Mexico can't cite non-scientific rationales, such as cultural concerns, to restrict biotechnology. The issue became central during a high-profile dispute over Mexico's biotech corn policies. U.S. industry groups argue that predictable, science-based standards are essential for maintaining long-term investment in seed innovation and production. Ethanol is another focus. Mexico currently maintains an ethanol blending rate of about 5.8% and restricts blending in its 3 largest metropolitan areas. Martinez says corn growers are encouraging the use of USMCA's working group structures to provide technical assistance and encourage expanded ethanol adoption, which would boost U.S. exports while advancing environmental objectives. If dairy highlights enforcement tensions and corn underscores regulatory clarity, fresh produce illustrates why many groups are wary of any shift away from the trilateral structure of USMCA. In 2024, $2.8 billion in fresh fruit and nearly $2.5 billion in fresh vegetables were exported to Canada and Mexico. Since USMCA's enactment, U.S. fresh fruit export values have increased by 34% and vegetable exports by 14%. Alexis Taylor, Chief Global Policy Officer for the International Fresh Produce Association, says fresh fruits and vegetables move through an integrated North American supply chain that often crosses borders multiple times between growing, packing, processing, and distribution.
These outcomes really reflect the value of a trade framework that provides certainty for perishable products that must move quickly and predictably across the North American continent. This really shows the tangible value of market access provided by USMCA to our produce growers. USMCA supports one of the most integrated fresh produce markets in the world. And Canada and Mexico remain the top 2 export markets for U.S. fresh fruit and vegetables, underscoring really the importance of that strong North American trading bloc.
Taylor says produce trade depends on speed and predictability. Because fruits and vegetables are highly perishable, delays or regulatory fragmentation can quickly disrupt supply chains and raise consumer costs. So, what happens if USMCA isn't renewed? Although the coalition study doesn't model a non-renewal scenario, Swanson says the implications are clear. Removing the agreement's framework would introduce instability at a moment when the farm economy is already under pressure. Without renewal, tariffs could eventually snap back to pre-USMCA levels, depending on how the process unfolds. Even the uncertainty surrounding negotiations could influence planting decisions, capital investments, and forward contracting in commodity markets that depend heavily on export demand. Farm groups frequently describe USMCA as one of the most significant agricultural trade achievements of the last decade. The agreement was renegotiated during President Trump's first term with broad support from major commodity organizations. Now, as policymakers prepare for the review process, agriculture is sending a clear message: preserve the trilateral framework, strengthen enforcement where needed, and maintain science-based standards, but avoid destabilizing a trade relationship that underpins nearly $150 billion in economic activity and hundreds of thousands of American jobs. That's it for today. As always, the goal here is to better understand what's happening in agriculture and what it means beyond the headlines. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered.